I'm hoping to keep this pretty conversational, so please feel free to interrupt with questions at any time. You can put them in the chat. I'm going to ask Mike to help me try to monitor that when I share screen. I'm not great at also watching the chat, but also feel free to unmute and just speak up. I have probably a lot more to learn from you all than vice versa. There are a lot of folks on the call, so I'll be happy to just have time to talk, and I think we'll have some time to talk at the end as well. So let me share my screen. I think this is the right one. And if anyone could just give me a thumbs up that you can see the great, thanks, Mike. Perfect. So thanks again for asking me to be here. Oh gosh, I am so used to saying I'm zooming in from the unceded traditional lands of the Dena'ina people, but I actually flew to Tucson, Arizona today. And I used to make sure that I just need to make sure I know whose lands I'm on today. So I live and work and play on the land of the Dena'ina people up in Anchorage, but I'll have to do some little digging this afternoon to understand where I'm at. So I just like to acknowledge that at the beginning. And Recover Alaska, our mission is to reduce excessive alcohol use and harms across the state. And we try to do that at the systems level. We are not a provider of direct services. And so I'll talk through mostly around policy today, but I'll also touch on some of the other aspects of the work that we do. The use and misuse of alcohol in Alaska causes huge mental, physical, and behavioral health problems throughout the state. It tears apart individuals, their families, their friends, the entire community. I'm sure you all know this as participants on a call like this one today, but I'm also going to share just a little bit of that history because it is helpful to keep it top of mind, at least for me. So as you probably know, alcohol is the third leading preventable cause of death in the United States. An estimated 95,000 people die every year from alcohol-related causes. These deaths have been steadily increasing over the past 20 years, up from roughly 36,000 in 1999. And I just saw a stat a couple days ago. In 2020, the national alcohol mortality rate rose 25%. Which is just astronomical. In the past 20 years, it's been going up, and it's usually about a 3% increase per year. 2018 and 19, I think it was closer to a 5% increase, but 2020 saw a 25% increase in mortality from alcohol. Alaskans are dying from alcohol at a rate over twice as high as the national average, and Alaska Native people are dying at a rate at nearly 10 times higher. I will talk about health disparities a little bit more in a moment, but I highlight that not to say they have a problem and we don't, I as a white person. I'm highlighting it to say that we as a society have a problem that we must work collectively to address, and that it is unacceptable for any group of people to be experiencing that type of rate of mortality. And just in terms of COVID in Alaska, I'm not sure what this looks like for you all, but we did some surveys that showed about 30% of the respondents to the survey used alcohol to cope with difficulties of the pandemic. They were drinking more than they had prior to the pandemic because of stress, which we know to be the most dangerous type of drinking with the highest likelihood to lead to disorders later. And roughly 5% of those respondents who were using drugs or alcohol to cope with stress had returned to use from a prior recovery or period of sobriety. And then for us, 58% of respondents who sought services found it very or somewhat difficult to obtain mental health or drug alcohol treatment services. And during 2020, the first year of the pandemic, the highest cause of visitation to an emergency department was for alcohol-related disorders for people aged 18 to 64. which is also, I mean, it is often near the top of the list, but for the first year of the pandemic, that was the #1 cause. So I don't love highlighting these negative stats, but I do it every time to make sure people feel really grounded and remember why we're here talking about the work that we do. I also like to highlight some of the positives, though. That's some of the work that we do, trying to highlight positive social norms. We know it's an effective way to help shift attitudes and beliefs and eventually behavior. So on the bright side of all of those stats, from our same survey, about 75% of respondents have shown resiliency during the pandemic by saying that it was very true or somewhat true that they either had found new ways to connect with family and friends, that they felt they had the emotional connections that they need, or that they helped others with financial or practical support at some point during the pandemic. So it's not all doom and gloom. I want to ask you for a moment to just put your hand on your heart. I know after a long day of looking at a computer screen, sometimes I am all in my brain and not in my body. And so I like to put your hand on your heart and just listen to your breathing for a moment. And just note that in this one action, we're observing at least 5 major but separate components of our human body and the systems that interact with each other. Our circulatory system, respiratory, skeleton, digestive, nervous. And so I do that sometimes too, to think about the work of Recover Alaska. We try to really stay at the system level. So we look at the bigger picture and consider the way that various systems interact with each other every day. So trying to think about the justice system, trying to think about our education system, trying to think about systems of oppression and how those interact with all of the work that we do. Speaking of which, I also like to call on some of the giants. So Audre Lorde said, "I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own." So in order to do systems change work, we cannot ignore systems of oppression like racism, colonization, patriarchy, heteronormatism. There are a lot of them. And so Recover Alaska also does equity work. And we do this sort of at 3 levels. We do personal equity work. So we have a little bit of budget devoted to do trainings, and we have staff meetings to talk about those trainings or talk about resources we have found, almost like a book club, but for equity, to make sure that I'm continuing to learn and check my privileges, and just so that I try to make sure that I'm as aware as I can be and trying to stay humble around that. I have a lot left to learn. We also do internal work. So right now we are in the middle of an equity assessment for Recover Alaska for our structure and our procedures. And then we also do some external work, which sometimes just looks like calling out recent activities or news in our newsletter. Sometimes looks like trainings that we offer on various aspects of oppression. And we've also hosted a couple of different learning cohorts where folks can travel through some of this work together for a period of weeks.
Hey, Tiffany.
Yeah.
As far as the equity assessment, is that something you guys are doing internally or working with somebody? Is it like a self-assessment, or how does that work?
Yeah, we started out thinking maybe we could do a self-assessment and quickly realized it would be beneficial to have somebody come in and help us, because we don't know what we don't know, and we're probably biased against ourselves or toward ourselves or whatever that right language is. So we hired a contractor, and I'll talk in a minute about the alliance that we have, but within the umbrella of Recover, we operate a statewide alcohol misuse prevention alliance for health and wellness. And they actually started doing this assessment first and said, well, we can't assess our structure without including Recover. And so we started looking at that, and we are not a nonprofit. We qualify as a nonprofit, but we have a fiscal sponsor over us. And so we said, well, we can't really assess ours without also looking at theirs. So it's become this actual like 9-month process now where we're looking at where power is held and how that works. And within the alliance, we try to operate really equitably with kind of a flattened hierarchy, and we don't do voting. We do this, we operate under consent to make sure that all decisions are within people's range of tolerance, even if they don't fully agree with them, they at least don't feel harmed by them or see any red flags. And so we're trying to push that out through Recover as well and shift some of our governance models, but it's a long process and it's hard because almost all organizations are structured in that really hierarchical top-down way, which is probably not the best way, especially to enact any kind of like real societal change. So it's very much a process for us. Thanks for asking that question. And another reason that we do this, and that in the work that we do, we try to really center populations who are struggling the most, whether that's from alcohol or from the related harms of alcohol. And by focusing on those populations, you know, it might seem like we are limiting our scope, but in fact, you know, a rising tide lifts all boats. By helping that and by reducing that outrageous mortality rate for Alaska Native people, we will decrease the entire mortality rate for the state. So that's part of why we do that type of work. So again, just to talk kind of quickly, give you an overview about the 4 different main areas where we do work. So we increase access to information about services and resources, and that's kind of our access to care work. We are piloting a model right now on integrated care coordination, so to have a coordinator between primary care and behavioral health and medication-assisted treatment and detox and mental health counseling, and even some resources like transportation and housing. So we're working on that right now, and as well as providing resources through our site and kind of a Get Help Now button to try to help people access services. We do social norms change, so trying to reduce stigma around alcohol use disorders and reduce that shame, and to really celebrate recovery and sobriety. We do advocacy to change policy to create a safer, healthier, and more equitable built environment. And we coordinate the State Alcohol Misuse Prevention Alliance. And at the end, I'll talk just a little bit more about some of those other things. But for now, we will really be looking at policy today. So there's a book called Alcohol, No Ordinary Commodity, and it is a collaborative effort by an international group of addiction scientists to help improve the connections between addiction science and alcohol policy, which is also some of the work that the board, Mike and I serve on together, the U.S. Alcohol Policy Alliance, try to do. And so that group identifies 3 best buys in alcohol policy, which are pricing, so taxes or minimum unit pricing, availability, which are things like population limits or density, hours of sale, and then marketing, which we don't have a lot of great examples of here in the United States because it's so hard to do and it would need to be a national effort, but it is worth talking about anyways, especially because the alcohol industry says that it will regulate itself through corporate social responsibility, which really means that they just set their own rules and restrictions, which are ineffective at best and actually usually quite harmful. But they identify these 3 kind of best buys as being highly cost effective, and they're generally accepted to be the best strategies to pursue in terms of health policy related to alcohol, in terms of kind of bang for your buck and the reduction in harms that we see from them. And so why don't we just do all of them? And the answer is big alcohol. They are so great at pretending that excessive alcohol use is an individual choice and a personal failing, and ignoring all of the systems of harm like poverty and lack of adequate housing, white supremacy, all the things I've talked about a little bit already today, as well as their own very predatory and unethical tactics. Solutions to combating big alcohol have to be grounded in those same firm beliefs as the fight for equity. We need fiery activism, we need relentless hope, and we need unyielding resistance. In short, we just kind of have to give it all we have all the time. We have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and we have to do it all the time. And just saying that out loud, I recognize that that is a heavy lift. And so that's why it's so important to have coalitions and groups like the one that you are all a part of, so that we can remember that we're not alone in this work. We can talk to other people for advice and help, and to lift us up when we're having a hard day, because there are hard days that come with this work, and so that we can celebrate each other. You know, it's some of the, as a person who's also in recovery, it feels like some of the same type of shame and stigma and effort to do this work every day. But luckily I get to do it with a really healthy and clear mind. And the evidence is really clear. There are so many strong policies that will work to reduce death and disease related to alcohol. So it just feels really rewarding and really worth it to me. So I'm going to focus on, one of the things I'll focus on is our taxes. Anchorage, we passed an alcohol tax in Anchorage in 2020. So I'll be, thank you. Yeah, we got to celebrate these wins. So I'll be talking a little bit about how we did that. And first, why we did that. So alcohol taxes work. Alcohol taxes reduce drinking, as well as some of the harms of drinking, such as the incidence of vehicle crashes, especially among young adults, reducing sexually transmitted diseases, and alcohol-related mortality. It's essentially a user fee, so those who don't drink don't pay, and those who drink excessively would pay the largest portion of the tax, because we did a sales tax. So that is going direct to the consumer. There are also excise taxes, which are done at the wholesale level. So that direct correlation isn't quite the same, but we did a sales tax. So this deters youth who are price sensitive, as well as heavy drinking, because the price per drink is slightly higher. And so it just naturally promotes slightly more moderate drinking. As a public health strategy, again, they're endorsed by all of the leading authorities. And for us in Anchorage, we had tried 8 different times, not Recover Alaska, just in general, the community had tried 8 times over the past 20 years to pass an alcohol tax. And so we decided to go for number 9.
Hey, Tiffany.
Yeah.
Back to so as a sales tax increase, was that deliberate versus an excise tax, or what was, and if so, what was the thought process behind it?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We have a state excise tax on alcohol already, and that was last increased in 2002. And it was a big to-do, and we got put on this list of big alcohol. They got really mad about it, and they said, never again. And so they watch us, and they come and they bring all of their money every time when we think about it. But I also think that part of the reason, so we weren't looking for an excise tax in Anchorage, but I think part of the reason is also just how our structure works. I don't know that we would have been legally allowed to do an excise tax, but the people can pass by a vote sales tax. And it's just important to look into all of that and to figure those rules out. Like, we had to figure out, we were going to try to gather signatures to get it on the ballot. But if we did that, we couldn't restrict the revenue. It would just go to the general fund, and we knew it wouldn't pass. So we had to find assembly champions to do it. And we have like some other weird rule in our charter where it has to pass by a supermajority, unless they write it in the thing and the assembly passes it with a supermajority. Then we only needed a regular majority of the people. None of these details matter for you all. It only matters to say that you should talk with people who know that for your city or community or whatever kind of level of government you're working with, so that you don't accidentally start down the wrong path and have to change halfway through.
Yeah, Bill.
And then the other, just one other thing quickly about sales tax versus excise tax. Sales taxes essentially are indexed for inflation. Excise taxes stay flat. So if we set an excise tax back in 2002, which we did to get 60, I can't remember, but it was basically we're collecting 60 cents. And then over time, inflation has gone up quite a bit. where that tax has stayed the same. And so we're getting much less percentage. So if you are to go for an excise tax, I would just strongly encourage to write in indexing for inflation so that you're not losing value over time.
Yeah, I just want you to know that some of your listeners are interested in that. The Michigan Council on Alcohol Problems has had as a priority to raise the taxes here in Michigan on booze. Unfortunately, we haven't known where to go on that, so we're listening heavily here. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And my contact information is at the end. If there's any way that I can be helpful throughout the process, I'm super happy to keep talking about this. I'm not sure how kind of deep to go right now, but happy to follow up with anything that might be helpful.
One more quick question about taxes.
please.
On the, was the industry less, were they more receptive to the sales tax versus the excise tax, or not necessarily?
No, they hate all
Okay.
taxes because they
Okay.
know
Yeah.
they work.
All right,
and they
good.
need people to be drinking excessively. That's where they make their money. They don't make money off of people having 4 drinks a week. They make money off of people having 10 drinks a night. They dislike all of them. And so the year before we did it, our mayor tried to do a sales tax on alcohol, and the industry immediately raised about $350,000 and completely squashed their campaign. The mayor also didn't do a great job and kind of walked away and raised 1/10 of that. So it was a double-edged sword there. But they certainly came to push back against our campaign. Like, they definitely care, and they didn't care which version it was. They just didn't want to see any kind of increase at all. So for us, our campaign success, I would say one of our strongest tools was data. We started polling in 2016, looking at a statewide excise tax increase because our governor talked about maybe putting it on his budget. That didn't go anywhere, but when we polled, we saw that the majority of Alaskans were in favor of a tax. And we continued to poll every year over the next 5 years, and that continued to be true. And we asked other questions like, would you be more likely to vote for a candidate who was in favor of a tax? And the answer was yes. And then once we got into our actual campaign, we asked a lot of questions. Since we had just lost in 2019, we asked, why didn't you vote for it? What would make you vote for it? And we were really trying to target that middle ground. It's interesting that we lost, since all the polling said the majority of people want it, which is true, but that's where the tax campaign came in. The industry's campaign was strong enough that it pushed out their voters, while the pro side was weak enough that it didn't get out the vote. And it was enough to shift what all of our polling data told us, so that the majority did not want it. And so we knew, besides polling, we also needed to raise money. Those are the 2 biggest things that we did to win the campaign. And so we polled again, like I said, asking where people would want the revenue dedicated. And this is a key piece to Recover Alaska running the campaign. For us, the tax itself was the public health win. So we could burn the money and I would still fight for that tax. We could put it into roads or building a new port of Anchorage, and I would still go for the tax. And we were just looking for what was going to win it. And thankfully, it was really aligned with what people with like harms of alcohol. So people wanted public safety. People wanted prevention of child abuse, sexual assault, and domestic violence. People wanted more substance use disorder treatment, mental health services, and homelessness services. So then once we found that out, we polled again saying, okay, but what's the language we should use? Because you're telling us homelessness, but when we tried homelessness last time, that lost it. And so we really tried to get very specific in that polling. We also asked, where do you get your news? Who do you trust? Who are you listening to help us find our spokespeople and to help us know where we should purchase ad time? And we had a volunteer who is helping us, who is great at data analytics, who could actually look at the polls and do that work, because that's not my forte. So also I would say all volunteers are great volunteers. We had somebody who is ghostwriting op-ed pieces, and we would find the right person to sign it to get it in the paper every week or every other week. We had people hosting friend-raising parties. We said yes to all help. We said yes to all partners. And that's really what won it for us. I also hired somebody to do the campaign, and I don't think his strongest suit is not just like grassroots advocacy, but he was a former US senator. So he was great at helping us to raise some money, and he's a politician. And I'm not great at spinning words. If somebody asks me a question, I want to give them a very direct research-based answer, which is not helpful in like winning sound bites on the news. So he was like, no, when they ask you about this, answer with this. And I said, those aren't related. He said, it doesn't matter. You have to own the message and say, these are the top 3 talking points that are going to win us the election. So those are the only things you say, and just make it work, which is a reframe for me, but it works. And it was all true. So I didn't feel like I was ever being like, I was never lying. I was just being political, which is kind of gross, but got us the win. And not nearly as gross as any of the other side's tactics. So I feel above board on this. We got a lot of different partners. We got firefighters and nurses, the faith-based community, the Children's Trust. We also got a chain liquor store to actually give money to the campaign because they thought that it was going to reduce shoplifting for them. And so they didn't donate to Recover Alaska. We don't accept those funds, but they donated to the campaign account that we had to set up. That was for lobbying purposes. We also did some polling to ask about what kind of accountability measures were going to make or break it. We thought, would sunsetting the tax help, which I was not interested in, but no, so that's what, when you see this built-in accountability, that also came from the polling, and we put it in there so that people in Alaska don't really trust government. And so we put in these measures to say, you don't have to trust them. It's written into the law that they can't mess up where the funding goes. They have to talk about how they're going to use it every year. It's a public process, all of this. And I do see the question about faith-based. We have it's Anchorage Faith and Action Community Together. And so it's a coalition of multiple different denominations coming together around advocacy issues. And so it was really helpful. They authored an op-ed, and so it's nice to help them bring their population and say why it should be important to the faith-based population. And they helped me set up a lot of different presentations. So I went to multiple different churches or religious groups to give my presentation to multiple different congregations that otherwise I wouldn't have access to. I would have access to one, but not all of the different groups that they brought together on our behalf. And then they also had some representatives who came to give public testimony at the assembly meetings when we were trying to get it onto the ballot. Like I mentioned, the op-ed, and so they just really helped us gain more folks to be in favor. And the other important thing to note here about polling and education is that any type of funding can be used for that. I know a lot of different funding cannot be used for lobbying, money from the state, money from certain private foundations, but for polling, research, education, that's all fair game. And so Recover Alaska didn't give a huge amount of money to the campaign. Excuse me, we spent a good portion of our money doing all that polling and research and making educational materials. And then as soon as we started saying, vote yes, that all went through the campaign, and those were the dollars that we raised. So just to distinguish there, I know that sometimes lobbying is a scary word for folks in nonprofit or coalition type work, and we are allowed to lobby. You just have to follow certain regulations and report it in certain ways. And again, that's a thing that I would check in on your own state guidelines around. But we are allowed to do it. Okay. We won on April 7th, 2020. We passed a 5% retail sales tax on alcohol. Oh, I think I have to somehow get this. It's supposed to actively be playing. Let's see. There we go. I am including this because it is really important to celebrate your wins. Even when you don't win, like celebrate everything that you learned while trying and failing. People's blood, sweat, and tears go into these things, and that's worth recognizing and celebrating however you can. So I would just encourage every step of the way, every time you get a donation, celebrate it. Every time you get, when you get put on the ballot, celebrate it, even though you still have to win the ballot. Celebrate and rest, because after the campaign, there's more work. So for us, oh, come on, switch slides, come on. There we go. So for us, the next big lift was, once it had passed, making sure that the revenue went where it was supposed to go. And so we ended up, I was not really expecting to do this work, but we ended up leading a coalition of nearly 200 stakeholders, intentionally inviting Indigenous and Black leaders and other leaders of color, the LGBTQIA community, people with lived experience of homelessness, poverty, addiction, to establish a citywide theory of change for how to spend the revenue today for the biggest impacts tomorrow. And so we wanted to make sure that all of the funding wasn't going to go to this, like the bottom level, which is important. It's important to have overnight shelter. It's important to have support for these things, for these negative things after they've happened. But it's also really important to start working toward those higher two levels and trying to stop those things before they happen, trying to reduce domestic assault, domestic violence, sexual assaults, child maltreatment by helping to support housing, good jobs, understanding of positive relationships, thriving neighborhoods. And I'm so glad that we did this. As we were in the campaign, we often talked about programs or policies that we thought the funding might go to as examples. But by leading this group of stakeholders, I got to learn that some of the programs that I thought was maybe an obvious choice was actually causing harm to people, or that too much of the funding was already going to these well-known organizations and not enough was going to programs that we'd never heard of. And so it was a very intense 5 months of convening and tracking what we heard and truth testing it and trying to build consensus, but it was super powerful and helped to trigger the first intergovernmental meeting between our assembly and the tribes, asserting tribal sovereignty and recognizing them. And so we ended up not advocating for any single group, but instead all of us collectively advocated for this theory of change, and highlighted that the assembly, our local government, needed a more equitable fund distribution process, so that it wasn't just the people who know an assembly member getting the bulk of the funding, and instead establishing some really open, transparent process. And so our next step will be evaluation. We will need to look and really show the positive health impacts of the tax itself, as well as we are working right now on trying to highlight some of those impact stories to make sure that the community in Anchorage knows what the alcohol tax is funding. And so we're making another series of videos and blog posts highlighting some of the success stories that have come out of this tax funding. We raised $13.4 million in 2021, which is even higher than we had estimated, and will be a little higher next year because we didn't start it until February. So that feels super positive. Okay, I'm going a little bit over time. Oh, and here's a slide about what I was talking about with excise tax. The red line is where it is. If it was keeping up with inflation, it would be that gray line. So just as a visual for what I had been talking about. I'm going to try to go pretty quickly through the rest of this so that we can maybe have some conversation. So the next best buy is availability. And I know that you probably can't read this, but it was the best graphic that I had already created. So we are also working on Senate Bill 9, which has been a 10-year process of trying to look at Title IV, which are all of our laws around alcohol in the state, and update them and revise them. It is really a broken title right now. And so about half of our bill just kind of cleans it up, reorganizes, defines things. It makes it easier for the Alcohol and Marijuana Control Office to actually be able to follow and enforce, and for licensees to understand. But then the other half is actual substantive change. And one of the biggest things for public health and safety is we are closing a loophole in our population limit system, which basically said it had limits, but then if you ever gathered 100 signatures, you could just have another outlet. So we're closing that and trying to make alcohol limit, population limits more consistent across license types, and also getting rid of a lot of license types that are like, there's this weird law that if you happen to be on a cruise ship in Juneau, you have to get your wine through a florist, because some florist knew a legislator at some point and actually had that written into state law. So there's a lot of stuff like that that just needs to like be cleaned up and taken out. We also are doing things like statewide keg registration to try to add a little bit of liability for social hosts to provide alcohol to young people. We are adding licensee liability for when a minor is served at a bar or in a liquor store, or somebody is overserved at a bar. Right now, there's only liability for the bartender, and the penalty is so high that police don't usually follow up. So none of those, they usually just die before anything happens. So by adding this licensee liability, now the license holder will get a fine, and every time it will be reported to AMCO, so that if there was a bad operator who had these again and again and again, they could talk about taking away that license or making them change some internal policies. Also, we have zero regulation around online shipment right now of alcohol. So anyone from the lower 48 can ship any kind of alcohol they want anywhere in the state and leave it on the doorstep. So we are trying to close that. We were hoping initially for just wine, but through the amendment process, it is now beer, alcohol, liquor, and wine. But we at least kept the limits pretty low, so nobody can order 12 cases of wine and then bootleg it throughout some of our regions that are dry and not allowed to have alcohol at all. I think that's all I'm going to say about that right now, other than just to reiterate, this is a 10-year process that we've had to been working on with the alcohol industry. I meet with them every week with the alcohol lobbyists. And so that took a long time. There were about 3 or 4 years of just relationship building to get to the point where we could come together and find solutions that were not too harmful to health that they accepted as well.
On the population, you said the population limits. What are the limits in Anchorage or Alaska?
For the most part, what we are hoping to set them almost all at 1 to 3,000. Right now, there are a couple random licenses that are 1 to 1,500. Those would be increased to 1 to 3,000. And then the alcohol industry actually mandated that it's 1 to 12,000 for brewery or distillery tasting rooms, because bars think that they're losing business because everyone's going to a tasting room, which is probably not true, but it's not, it doesn't hurt public health, so I stayed out of it. But 1 to 3,000 generally is our average. And then the third best buy is marketing. And like I said, we don't have many positive examples of this in the United States. One way that this can look, we don't allow happy hours in Alaska, and we don't allow that type of marketing. But we do still have, you know, there are alcohol ads in our university in the sports complex, so directly targeting 18 to 22-year-old people, and that's legal in Alaska, and it's not in some places, but that's an example of one marketing thing that could be done at a state level. And so, but I wanted to include it anyways, and just to reiterate how big alcohol often talks about this as an individual choice, a personal moral failing, stigmatizing the disease, and not taking any responsibility, rather than really recognizing it as a societal shift that needs to happen. And even when they do things like promoting responsible drinking, that again is pinning the individual with the burden there. But even when they do things like promoting dry January, they'll say, today's the day most people give up on dry January. You don't have to do that. Drink Heineken Zero. So within that ad, they're saying, number one, the norm is to give up and drink alcohol. If you're not going to follow the norm, then you can drink Heineken Zero. And by doing that, research shows that then people feel like Heineken's doing such a good job. I'm gonna buy some Heineken to support them. And whether it's Heineken Zero or not, that's still money in Heineken's pocket. And they're still promoting the norm of drinking, even if you're trying to take 1 month off. So it's just one example of why it's a terrible idea to let them manage themselves and regulate themselves. And we can't do much about that. So the best that we do instead is try to promote other norms, promote real norms, promote positive, healthy social norms. And so, for example, underage drinking, while there are youth who certainly drink underage in Alaska, we did a campaign called Be You, where we highlighted, 78% of Alaska's high school youth don't drink alcohol. Like, here's what they do instead, and recognizing what the norm actually is, because people just want to do what's normal for the most part, especially youth. They want to fit in. And so by highlighting what the majority is actually doing, it's just helping to promote that activity instead of talking about what we don't want, which promotes what we don't want. And so for us, doing those types of campaign means doing this equity work that I talked about, and also really means trying to center other people and to stop having me and a group of people in Anchorage creating campaigns for Southwest rural Alaska, where their norms are completely different. They live off the road system. They have to take a plane and a boat or a snow machine to even be able to get to their village, and their access to everything doesn't look like my access to anything. So we've been doing a lot more work on trying to hold focus groups or even one-on-one interviews with folks in the target population. So right now we're working on, we noticed we do some annual polling, not annual, every like 3 years we do polling. And we saw that folks in Southwest understand that people shouldn't drink before 21, whereas in Anchorage, people are like, yeah, 18's fine. But in Southwest, they don't have as much knowledge around alcohol during pregnancy. And so we're trying to focus on zero drinks while pregnant, but it is such a sensitive topic that our campaign is going to look like, what are the strengths of being a pregnant person, and how does that person want to be supported, thereby reducing the shame and stigma and need for substance use, hopefully. And we just really try to meet people where they're at. And so during the pandemic, oh, whoops, here's the slide that highlights what I just said. So during the pandemic, we had to really shift to online presence, and to doing more radio spots, and to doing more virtual based things. And so we did this campaign right in the first year of the pandemic, after asking people kind of what would be helpful, and hearing what kind of messages they wanted us to target. This is our sober virtual lounge. So we also created a virtual room, and people can click on most of the little images in here are things you can click on. So these are our 3 sober heroes. We're highlighting these 3 folks. It's Sobriety Awareness Month in Alaska right now. So if you click on them, you can see their stories. We have like podcasts about sobriety. We have tools like a anonymous screening tool, things like that. So people can click around the room for different resources. We did a podcast series, just again, trying to find people. So podcasts that aren't usually about alcohol, we got all of them to talk about alcohol and sobriety last month during Sobriety Awareness Month. We have worked with the state on an addiction in the workplace toolkit to help employers understand how to support people who are struggling with alcohol. So maybe instead of firing them, they can get them support, or how to have conversations if somebody's worried about an employee's drinking. And now we're actually doing some updates to that as people come back from a virtual workforce. And we know that the need for this will be even higher because people have gotten used to being able to drink over their lunch hour in their sweatpants. And then, this is just a slide about our alliance. And so one of the things in terms of equity, we wanted to make sure that we had regional co-chairs throughout the state. So we pay them for their time to help us understand how it's different in Northwest Alaska versus Southeast Alaska versus Anchorage or Fairbanks versus the Aleutian chain. So, and this is just a map of that alliance. These are some of the different organizations. We have about 40 organizations who are regularly attending, and that's not all of them focus on alcohol. Some of them focus on violence or suicide, but we recognize that there are shared protective factors and shared risks. And so we come together to try to see what we can do together. And then our access to treatment, I already mentioned this, our pilot project, but then we also have there's an app called Step Away that helps people. It's undergone 4 NIAAA clinical trials. And it does help people reduce their drinking or quit drinking, and it's just on their phone. So during the pandemic, we set up a process for Alaskans to get that app for free. It costs a monthly subscription, but we are giving it away. Okay, this just means you have to change hearts and you have to change minds and try to meet people where they're at and see what gifts they have to bring to the table and how to utilize those gifts. And then, because we already talked a little bit about how hard this work is, it's just so important for me to recognize that self-care is the most crucial and radical thing that I can do. And it's so important to support each other and check in with each other. And during the pandemic, we shifted. So now all of our meetings start with a check-in. And even if it's really brief, it's helpful to remember that we're actually humans first before we are employees, and that our personal, like who we are, matters, and bringing our full selves to the table. And so we try to do these check-ins, and it has really shifted, and it has made us more effective, I think, and just better partners together. And so this year has been, or the past 2 years now, have been a real collective trauma for all of us. And so I just encourage you to support each other and reach out to each other and have grace, allow extensions, figure out how we can help each other. And so I just love to read this. So if you want to take another moment to place your hand over your heart, can you feel it? That is called purpose. You're alive for a reason. So don't ever give up. And that concludes my slides. So sorry, I went really fast. I went really fast, but mostly because I would love to just be able to talk with you all also, if there are other questions. So I'm going to stop share so we can see each other.